In the scenic valleys of Vermont, there's a tiny town called Paulet that was rocked with a gruesome triple homicide in September of 2024. It was one of the many cases in America where an entire family was mercilessly slain. And what's even more chilling is that authorities have no clue who might have done it. The mystery deepens even further when you consider that the head of the household, Brian Crossman, had just been elected to a local office. Did this have something to do with his tragic death? And if so, why were his wife and stepson slain alongside him? These are just some of the questions we'll try to answer today as we unpack the puzzling demise of an entire family and the multiple mysterious individuals that might have been involved. The victims of this senseless violence were 46-year-old Brian Crossman Sr., his wife, 41-year-old Erica Crossman, and Erica's son, 13-year-old Colin Taft. Though Brian wasn't Colin's biological father, he'd taken on the role of stepfather and provided a loving home for his wife's child. However, there are still many unanswered questions about the Crossman household. The fact that Brian referred to himself as Senior suggests that there's a Brian Crossman Jr. out there somewhere. And since Brian Sr. himself was just 43, it's unlikely that Brian Jr. was much older than Colin. He was probably a teenager or at most in his early 20s, unless Brian had had him at a very young age. And then there's the matter of Erica's maiden name. According to reports, Erica Crossman used to be Erica Pelusiak before she married Brian. If that's the case, Colin's surname, Taft, likely comes from his biological father. One has to wonder, where was this mysterious Mr. Taft? And under what circumstances did Erica leave him? Given that she brought Colin along to this new home, there's a chance that her relationship with her former partner didn't end on good terms. It should be mentioned that Brian and Erica had gotten married just a few months before this incident in June of 2024. It's unknown if Erica was a resident of Paulet prior to marrying Eric, but considering it's a town of just 1,400 people, it's more likely that she moved in from out of town. One thing we can say for certain is that Brian hadn't lived in that home for a long time before the wedding. It's now time to start talking about another wrinkle in this case, the historic farmhouse Brian and his new family had moved into. Based on information released to the press, Brian was born to enormous generational wealth. The farmhouse on Vermont Route 133 that became the scene of the crime had been in the Crossman family for generations, but it appears to have fallen into disrepair at some point. This theory is based on Brian specifically setting up shop there to start fresh, but the farmhouse wasn't empty when he decided to move in. Brian's sister, whose name hasn't been released to the public, had apparently been living there, but reports seem to suggest that she hadn't been taking good care of it. You see, Brian didn't just start living at the farm. Neighbors stated that he'd been cleaning it up and trying to bring it back to working order. He wanted to grow things and potentially run the farm like a proper business, indicating that his sister had neglected the farm and the house over the years. By the time Brian and Erica got together, though, the farmhouse had been given a fresh coat of bright white paint. It was clean and put together enough to host their wedding, providing a beautiful backdrop to the happiest day of their lives. But those white walls were soon going to be painted red with the family's blood. Before we get into that, we must first understand how bizarre Brian's decision to start working the farm truly was. Brian had spent his entire life in Paulet, and everyone in the town loved him since he was a boy. He attended Wells Village School in the local community, where Principal Jean Marie Oakman admired him for his kind, generous personality. He was part of a big family, with 5 brothers and a sister along with countless cousins and other relatives. By all accounts, Brian was fiercely protective of all of them. Principal Oakman has said that he was especially kind to his sister, suggesting that she needed some extra support from her big brother. Indeed, Brian spent much of his life being extremely loyal to his kin. But it seems like he strayed from the flock at some point. Instead of operating the family farm, he became a lineman for a utility company called Green Mountain Power, which provided electricity to 250,000 Vermont residents. This made Brian an important man, and the community honored him for it. And yet, there might have been something sinister going on behind the scenes. After all, we've already established that Brian likely had a biological son that was nowhere in the picture. Where had this son gone? If he was still in Pollitt, how did he manage to avoid giving a statement about his father's demise? That too in a tiny community of just over 1,000 people. As for Erica, her background is practically shrouded in mystery compared to Brian's. No information has been released on when she came to Pollitt, but we can assume that she entered Brian's life during a time of great change. 2024 was by no means a normal year for Brian. For starters, he met a woman that basically swept him off his feet. A woman he loved so much that he decided to help her raise her boy with no questions asked. But that's just one of the many changes he went through over the year. After devoting his life to the Pollitt community, Brian was a shoo-in for political office. The tiny town didn't have many opportunities in that space, but Brian managed to secure a seat in one of the most exclusive political entities around, the Select Board. This political body is unique to New England's style of governance. Members of the Select Board exercise broad executive powers that basically make them managers of the local area. Early in 2024, Brian was elected to a seat on the board, which made him one of the most powerful men around. Not only did he work for a utilities company that supplied electricity to a third of Vermont, but he was also on the council that made big decisions about his own town. Brian was moving up the ranks faster than anyone could have imagined, and it seemed like he had nowhere to go but up. If Brian had continued down this path, there's a chance that he'd have become chairperson of the board. Such a rapid rise didn't just bring him personal success, though. It also might have put a target on his back, and not just for the violence that ended his life. But more on that later. For now, let's discuss the final change that occurred in 2024, which had to do with the Crossman farmhouse. We don't know where Brian lived before moving in there, but it's clear that he wanted to make it a home for his new family. According to the neighbors, it seemed like he wanted a fresh start. From what exactly? That's a question that neither authorities nor relatives of the deceased have been able to answer. It might have had something to do with the whirlwind romance between him and Erica, which seemed to culminate in an ad hoc wedding at the recently renovated farmhouse. Or perhaps it had to do with Brian's political appointment. There are many theories we can provide, but first, we must take a look at how the violent events of September the 15th unfolded. With the stage now set, it's time to move on to the incident that extinguished 3 bright lives. It all began at 3:45 a.m. on a chilly Sunday morning. This was possibly the quietest time of the week for local police. Pollitt doesn't have much of a nightlife, and the community's strong Catholic roots meant that most residents woke up early for Sunday service. As a result, hardly anyone tended to be out at this time, which meant that police weren't expecting anything close to what happened. At 3:45, police received a call reporting a suspicious individual near the Crossman property. This was the first of many calls that police would receive before they finally headed over to Route 133. Once they arrived, they found a grisly scene. Brian, Erica, and Colin were long dead. Their bodies were riddled with bullets, indicating that a gunman had emptied an entire clip into the family before running off. However, these bullets hadn't been distributed equally across each victim. Brian had been shot multiple times in the torso before a final execution-style shot to the head. Erica, on the other hand, only received 1 shot to the head. As for Colin, police reports were more tight-lipped about the details due to him being a minor, but they did admit that he had multiple gunshot wounds as well. Multiple shots for Brian and Eric, but just a single headshot for Erica. Why hadn't the gunman treated all 3 victims with equal rage? Why was his violence directed mostly at the men in the household? Based on police reports, it appears that Brian was the main target, since his body contained the largest number of bullets. But we can't ignore the brutality of Colin's death either. Shooting a child of just 13 point blank requires either a burning lust for violence or a chilling disregard for human life. And what about the suspicious individual seen near the scene of the crime? That might just be the most interesting and puzzling aspect of this story. And in order to get to it, we must first discuss the seemingly unknowable motive behind the triple homicide. Was it mere coincidence that Erica married Brian not long after he became one of the most prominent men in the area? Could his rise to power have played a role in her romantic pursuit? Whatever the case may be, Brian's newfound authority made him a target in some more obvious ways as well. People tend to be envious of success, and with so little known about Erica's former partner and Colin's biological father, it's possible that this was a case of a jilted lover crossing the thin red line. That seems like a valid theory, but it's not the only one that's been floating around. Brian's rapid takeover of the family farm could have rubbed some of his brothers the wrong way. It's clear from the school principal's statements that Brian and his sister had a special relationship. Does that mean that he didn't get along quite as well with his brothers? Tensions between siblings are only natural, and they can get extremely heightened when there's money or property involved. Even though the Crossman farm was located in a relatively secluded part of the country, its market value would still be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. If his brothers felt like he cheated them out of their inheritance, this would be enough of a motive to take him out. This theory still doesn't explain the calculated, execution-style slaying of Erica, which is why some might say that the jilted ex-lover angle holds more weight. And then, of course, there are plenty of people that might have resented Brian for his success. With a job at a highly relevant local company, an extremely valuable farm to his name, plus a seat on the select board, Brian could have been the subject of anyone's envy. But there is a reason to suspect that a family member was involved, at least in some way, shape, or form. This reason has to do with the suspicious individual that neighbors reported to the police in the early hours of Sunday morning. As soon as police found the bodies, they knew that they'd died under mysterious circumstances. People don't get shot to death every day, least of all in sleepy little Pollitt, so authorities immediately set up an ad hoc headquarters at the local fire station. The deaths hadn't been confirmed as homicides yet. That would require an autopsy report, but police still had an investigation to conduct. When witnesses reported the suspicious individual to the police, they included a detail that's relevant to the entire case. What was this detail? The person was apparently completely covered in blood. This made locating them a top priority for the police, but surprisingly enough, it didn't take them long to track the individual down. They initiated a search of the surrounding area, which happened to include the Wells Village school that Brian had attended as a child. And who did they happen to find there? The same blood-covered individual reported in the 911 calls. Police immediately took him into custody, but revealed only two details. The first detail was that the individual claimed not to be involved in the homicide. This seems like an obvious enough statement. No one would admit to slaying a family of 3, but this person had their blood on his clothing. Forensic testing confirmed that the blood belonged to at least one of the victims. So despite his claims, this man was clearly a suspect that was at the Crossman residence during, or at least after, the incident had occurred. Now, according to the suspect, whose name still hasn't been released to the public, he supposedly stumbled across the residence after the Crossmans were already dead. He had their blood all over his clothing because he'd handled the bodies in some way. Why would he do such a thing? The answer to that lies in the second and final detail the police revealed. You see, this wasn't just any random person. According to reports, the suspect found at Wells Village School covered in the blood of the victims was actually a relative of the family. There's no word on whether he was related to Brian, Erica, or Colin, but the very fact that he's a relative at all raises more questions than it answers. And to make matters even more confusing, police released the suspect without charge and refused to explain the decision. With this case, it seems like every new revelation adds another layer to the never-ending mystery. Let's get into some of the questions we must now ask.
Feel sad for this.
Vermont State Police are continuing to investigate after 3 people were shot to death in their Pollitt home. State Police say no arrests have been made in connection to the homicides. The victims have been identified as Select Board member 46-year-old Brian Crossman, his 41-year-old wife Erica, and her 13-year-old son, Brian's stepson, Colin Taft. Investigators say this was not a random act, but it's still an active crime scene and investigation.
If we start with the obvious, What was a relative of the victims doing near the crime scene at that time? If we're to believe that he got their blood on him because he cradled their corpses, why did he run away instead of staying at the scene of the crime? And moreover, why did he run to the local school of all places? Hiding out at Brian's childhood school seems like an odd choice if this person was hiding at all. Based on what the police have said, it seems more like he gave himself up willingly as soon as they arrived on the scene. Did this person go to the school because it was a source of comfort for him? Perhaps because he went there as a child as well? The unknown individual remains a person of interest, but you might be wondering why the police didn't make any charges. Isn't the presence of the blood of the victims on his clothing enough of a probable cause for an arrest? The police are clearly doing their best here, but they also failed to respond to the first 911 call that informed them about a mysterious presence near the Crossman farm. If they'd just taken that call seriously, Brian and his family might still be alive today. This raises the question, did the police ignore the call on purpose? Brian was a well-connected man, a powerful man, and men like that tend to make enemies, especially in opposing government departments like the police. We're not saying there's corruption at play here, but these are questions we have to ask. The current position of the police is that this was a one-off incident that doesn't have any complex motive behind it, but Brian's status in the town makes that very unlikely. Relatives of the family have spoken about what an amazing person Brian was. They've talked about how hard he worked and how much he cared for the community. And yet, a few people are missing from these conversations. There's Brian Crossman Jr., for one, whose very existence hasn't been confirmed yet. If he doesn't exist, why would Brian add Sr. after his name in the first place? And then there's Erica's ex, who still hasn't resurfaced, despite his son and former lover dying a tragic demise. Will there be answers to any of these questions? We'll just have to wait and see. For now, the friends and family of the victims will have to bear the incredible trauma of this tragedy and hope that the police are able to make sense of what happened. Considering that nearly half of all homicides in the U.S. go unsolved, there's no guarantee that they'll be successful. On September 22nd, 1 week after the triple homicide, Brian Crossman Jr. admitted himself into a psychiatric facility, reporting serious mental distress. He had a history of mental issues, along with a learning disability that created a lot of tension between him and his father. Crossman lived in Granville, New York, not too far from Powlett. His grandmother had apparently told police that Crossman knew how to use firearms, and that he was capable of committing such a violent act. It turns out that he was also the suspicious, blood-soaked individual that police found. They were forced to release him due to lack of evidence, but upon gathering witness testimony, they were finally able to issue a warrant for his arrest. Police in Granville immediately brought him into custody under charges of fleeing from justice. Further reports revealed that he got blood on his clothing after trying to drag his father's corpse outside the home. Crossman had been visiting the family for the weekend, and he claimed that he went out for a walk and found their dead bodies when he returned. We now know this narrative to be false. It's currently unknown whether Crossman will be extradited to Vermont, but he's being held in custody without bail, and chances are that he'll be made to cross state lines to face justice for his crimes. What do you think of this case? Will the Crossman family ever find justice? Or will this be just another case that never gets solved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more videos like this, please be sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more true crime videos. See you in the next one.